Hello, and welcome to the first episode of UCLA InterAxon's Neuroscience for Kids. Today, we will be learning about the lobes of the brain, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. We all have brains, but why do we need them? To put it simply, your brain keeps you alive by helping you make sense of the world around you. From the thoughts you have, the movements you make, to all the little things you aren't really aware of, the brain is behind it all. In order to survive, you need your brain and all its power to help you out. Keeping you alive takes a lot of energy. The brain is small but hungry, and it consumes 25% of all the energy your body needs each day. Because the brain does so much, it needs to be organized to do its job. Therefore, the brain is divided into many different parts, each one serving a special purpose. By the end of this video, you will know a lot more about your noggin, so sit back and enjoy. Let your brain learn a little bit about itself.
We can start off this lesson by looking at the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain, making up 85% of your total brain weight. Any idea how much a human brain weighs? The average adult brain weighs about 3 pounds, so your cerebrum is about 2.5 pounds. The cerebrum is the big, wrinkly walnut that you think of when you hear the word brain, and it sits above your cerebellum and brainstem, which we'll talk about later. You can learn your times tables, answer your teacher's questions, and be an A+ student, all with the help of your cerebrum. That's because it's in charge of all sorts of higher brain functions, like memory, language, and decision-making. The cerebrum also processes signals from our sensory organs in order to let us see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. As mentioned before, the brain is divided into many parts, each with a special function. The cerebrum can be divided into 4 areas called lobes, and they are the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobes.
You may have noticed that the cerebrum is split into 2 big parts. These parts are called hemispheres and are connected by a bundle of fibers called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is shaped like the letter C and is about 10 centimeters long. That's about the size of a bagel. We can think of it as a bridge that lets messages from the right hemisphere cross over to the left hemisphere and vice versa. Recent studies on the famous physicist Albert Einstein's brain revealed that his corpus callosum was a lot thicker than average. That means his hemispheres had really strong connections and sent messages to each other really quickly. That's probably why he was so smart.
Now that we've covered the corpus callosum, we can talk about the lobes, or the 4 divisions of the cerebrum. Do you remember what they're called? They are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. We'll start off with the frontal lobe. The reason that the frontal lobe is called this is because it's literally in the front of your brain. It's the brainiest part of your brain and helps you plan and make good decisions. For example, the reason you decide to sit quietly and not start talking loudly to your friend in class is because the prefrontal cortex in your frontal lobe block signals that tell you to be loud. The frontal lobe also deals with personality, language, and movement. Have you heard the story of Phineas Gage? He was a railroad worker in the 1800s who suffered an accident where a metal rod made it through his frontal lobe. Before the accident, he was a really nice guy with lots of friends, but after it happened, he wasn't so nice anymore. Unfortunately, the frontal lobe is the part of the brain that gets injured most often, so if you'd like to skateboard or use those fancy schmancy electric scooters, make sure you're wearing a helmet because you need to protect that frontal lobe. This will keep you from losing all your friends like Phineas Gage. The frontal lobe also helps you talk and sing. It's home to Broca's area, a part of your left frontal lobe that deals with speech. People with damage to this area have Broca's aphasia, which means they can't say sentences that make sense. Can you say Broca? Now how about aphasia? Very good. There's another kind of aphasia where people can't understand speech, but we'll talk about that later. As mentioned before, the frontal lobe is also important for voluntary movement. Part of the lobe, called the motor cortex, is responsible for letting you move the way you want to move. A cool fact about the motor cortex is that the left side of it controls the right side of your body, and the right side of it controls the left part of your body. So if I wave my right hand at you, the left side of my motor cortex controls that movement. But if I want to dab with my left hand, my right motor cortex lets me do that. Do you remember the name of the structure that lets your left and right hemispheres talk to each other? That's right, it's the corpus callosum. A way to remember the frontal lobe's functions is by imagining Einstein sitting at the front of your brain. He would make smart decisions, have a curious personality, and talk about physics while waving at you. Now let's move on to the lobe behind the frontal lobe. This is the parietal lobe, and it tells you where you and other things are located in space and processes sensory information from your body. The part of the parietal lobe that helps you do all this is called the somatosensory cortex, derived from the Greek word soma, which means body. This somatosensory or body sensory cortex makes sense of the sensory input your body gets and tells you if your mug is hot or if your blanket is soft and fuzzy. It can also let you know that your friend is poking you because it gets signals from sensory receptors in your skin. One way to remember your parietal lobe's functions is to imagine a parrot pecking the top of your head. Parrot and parietal both start with the letters P-A-R, and the sensation at the top of your head would be processed by the somatosensory cortex in your parietal lobe.
Now, let's move on down to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is located on the sides of your brain near your ears. It's home to the hippocampus, which mainly deals with memory. What kind of word is hippocampus? Well, it can be broken down into two Greek roots, hippos, which means horse, and campos, which means sea monster. You'll notice that the hippocampus kind of looks like a seahorse, which the Greeks named it after. If thinking of a seahorse doesn't help you remember the memory function of the hippocampus, just think of a hippo on campus, going to class to learn and remember things for his test. Since it's so close to your ears, can you guess what else the temporal lobe is in charge of? That's right! The temporal lobe deals with hearing or auditory processing, which means that it translates the sounds your ears receive into speech and music you can understand. So when your parents ask you what you want to eat, or when your friends ask you if you want to go play, the auditory cortex of your temporal lobe lets you know what they're saying. And that's why the temporal lobe is extremely important. Imagine how difficult it would be if we all talked but couldn't understand what we were saying to each other. Unfortunately, that's true for some people with temporal lobe damage. Your temporal lobe is also home to Wernicke's area, which helps you understand speech. People with damage to this part have what's called Wernicke's aphasia, which means they can't understand speech. Can you say Wernicke? And how about aphasia? Nice job! Now, can you remember the first aphasia we talked about? That's right. It was Broca's aphasia in the frontal lobe, which means a person's sentences don't make sense. A way to remember that the temporal lobe deals with sound processing is by remembering that the tempo of your favorite song would be processed in your temporal lobe. And finally, at the very back of your brain is the occipital lobe. Have you ever had the back of your head accidentally hit during dodgeball? Did you then see stars or small bright lights in your vision? That's because the occipital lobe is in charge of visual processing, or making sense of the signals it gets from your eyes. Even though your eyes receive light rays from the things you look at, like a dog or this drawing, your occipital lobe helps you understand what you're seeing. For example, when you look up at the sky, you see a bright, yellow circle. The visual cortex in your occipital lobe processes the light, shape, and color to understand that what you're looking at is actually the sun. One cool fact about the occipital lobe is that it gets signals from the opposite eye. For example, part of the sun that your left eye sees gets sent to your right occipital lobe, and part of the sun that your right eye sees gets sent to your left occipital lobe. It's a good thing we have a corpus callosum to let our hemispheres communicate. Unfortunately, people with lots of damage to this lobe can have problems with their vision, so be careful and look around during dodgeball. One way to remember what your occipital lobe is in charge of is seeing that the O in occipital kind of looks like an eye.
Now that we've gotten through the lobes of the brain, we can finally take a look at the structures under the cerebrum. Have you ever had a contest to see who could balance on one foot the longest, or played hopscotch and made it easily to the other side? You were able to do that without much thinking thanks to your cerebellum. The cerebellum is a small structure that looks like a mini brain under the back of the cerebrum. It's mainly responsible for balance, coordinating your movements, and procedural memory, or remembering how to make certain movements. Now let's go through these three functions in order. Your cerebellum helps you spin around and move in circles like a ballerina, or ballerina, without falling over. If you end up spinning a little too fast and almost fall over, your cerebellum notices that mistake and coordinates your muscle movements to keep you from falling. Now think back when you first learned how to ride a bike. You may have lost your balance at first, but you could probably ride a bike now without even thinking about it. That's because the cerebellum stores procedural memories and helps you remember how to do things like walk, ride a bike, or drive a car when you're older. When things go wrong with the cerebellum, it can become hard to stay balanced. A person with a damaged cerebellum might find it difficult to walk in a straight line without tipping over. That's why the cerebellum is so important. It keeps our lives in balance.
And finally, we have our brainstem. You can think of the brainstem as a plant stem with your brain being the big mushy flower on top of it. Although it looks small, the brainstem plays a huge role in keeping us alive. It manages some of the brain's involuntary processes or things that we don't have to think about doing, like breathing or regulating our heart rates. Can you imagine how hard life would be if you had to think about making your heart beat? Imagine if you forgot. Now that we understand how important the brainstem is, though, we can cover its different parts. The brainstem has 3 parts, and from top to bottom, they're the midbrain, pons, and medulla. We'll start at the top of the brainstem, the midbrain. The midbrain deals with visual and auditory reflexes. Do you know what a reflex is? A reflex is an involuntary response to something. An example of a visual reflex is blinking when the eye doctor blows air into your eyes. You don't really have to think about blinking because your midbrain makes your eyes close automatically. An example of an auditory reflex, though, isn't so obvious, but when you hear really loud sounds, the midbrain makes the tiny muscles in your ear contract beyond your control. Moving on, in the middle of the brainstem, we have the pons, which has lots of different nerves running through it. The pons has been shown to play a role in dreaming and sleeping, so you can remember this function by thinking of a nice, relaxing pond you'd see in your dreams. And finally, we have the medulla. The medulla sits at the very bottom of the brainstem and controls your breathing and heart rate. To remember the medulla's function, you can picture a champion athlete wearing gold medals that cover her heart and lungs. The medulla gets a gold medal for keeping you alive.
Now that you've made the journey from your frontal lobe to your medulla, why don't we go over what you've learned today? Here's a quick quiz for your hippocampus. What are the names of the 4 lobes? They are the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes. Which brain structure would let you stand on one foot without falling over? Of course it would be your cerebellum, helping you keep your cerebalance. Now, which of the 4 lobes would process the tempo of your favorite song? If you're thinking temporal lobe, you're absolutely right. Which lobe would let you know that there's a parrot pecking at the top of your head? Just think of where the parrot is standing, above your parietal lobe. Which lobe would let you recognize this drawing as the sun? The occipital lobe. Is this getting too easy for you? Okay, well, which lobe is letting you understand what I'm saying right now? Did I get you there? It would be the temporal lobe because it processes sounds and has Wernicke's area to understand speech. If the temporal lobe lets you understand my questions, which lobe is letting you answer my questions out loud? The frontal lobe, yes. This is probably too simple for you now. Which part of your brainstem would help you sleep and dream about a pond? The pons is correct. Which part of the brainstem is helping you breathe and keep your heart beating? Is it the midbrain or the medulla? It's the medulla because the midbrain deals with audiovisual reflexes. Well, I bet you can't answer this one. What was the very first word I said in this video? It was hello. If you got the answer right, what structure helped you remember that? Yes, it was the hippocampus, which also helped you remember all the answers to get 100% on this quiz. Well, that just about wraps up today's lesson on the brain. We hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot about our favorite organ. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.